Hello, my name is Tosca Bruno van Vijfwijken and I direct the Transnational NGO initiative here at the Maxwell School. We have a visitor today, and that is Professor Christopher Pallas, and he is the assistant professor in conflict management at Kennesaw State University in Atlanta here in the US. And he undertakes a broad range of really interesting research projects on NGOs in civil society. So we'll talk about it. Thank you so much, Chris, for
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Spending the day with us and educating us about your research. So for those of us who don't know the nature of your research, tell us a little bit about the broad span of topics that you're interested in, and what you've told us earlier today about the kind of, one of your interests is the political economy of NGOs and civil society, which I thought was a really interesting perspective.
So I'd say that two of the things that I've done research on over the course of my career are, one, looking at questions of democracy, accountability, and legitimacy within civil society organizations, looking at who it is that civil society organizations represent, to whom they are accountable, and how their activities impact democracy within global governance and global governance institutions. So that's one piece. And then a second piece is what I think of as the political economy of transnational advocacy, where basically I'm looking at the economic environment in which NGOs operate and how that impacts the advocacy operations that they choose to undertake and the decisions that they make while conducting advocacy, and even sometimes the effectiveness of that advocacy. So there's obviously a lot of interrelation between those things, because an economically constrained actor may have difficulties doing the sorts of representation that would make democratization successful. So those are two of the main strands in my research. There are some other things, like we talked about earlier today, that I'm moving into, looking at aid reduction and its impact on local civil society. And we can discuss those things as well as you like, but that's kind of a new area under development.
And particularly the way you link the political economy with advocacy actors is an interesting one. I mean, we know from the literature that there is always this tussle between constructivist academics in international relations and political science who are talking about the norm-basedness of NGOs, and people who are pointing, like Clifford Bob and others, who are pointing more at the hard interest, if you will, and survival and opportunity, etc. And so you kind of bring some of these strands together. So you are assistant professor of conflict management in Kennesaw State University, is in the suburbs of Atlanta, as you told me. What's the nature of the center or department you are based in, and how does that work as a center or department relate to transnational NGOs?
Sure. So I teach in an interdisciplinary PhD program in international conflict management, and I have a fairly interesting mixed group of colleagues. So I have one group of colleagues, actually several of whom are Maxwell graduates.
Oh, really?
Yes, Tim Hedin, Heather Pincock, Volker Franke, they're Maxwell graduates, but one group of colleagues that really come out of sort of a mediation background, and they bring one part to the program. And then we have another group of colleagues that are really looking at sort of big macro issues, food security, for instance, or demobilization, disarmament, immigration, migration, those sorts of things. But the unifying theme is that we are interested in issues of conflict and the spillover effects of conflict. The thing that I bring to that things that I bring to that are kind of twofold, or the NGO elements are twofold. I mean, one is that NGOs tend to be intimately involved in a lot of peace building and reconstruction activities, and so understanding what NGOs do in those settings is very important to our work. And so some of the work that I'm doing right now, for instance, is looking at what happens when to local civil society and its role in peace building when aid declines in a post-conflict setting. So there's that piece, but then also many of the sort of broader policies that influence development or may lead to or avoid conflict are established at a global level, and NGO advocacy plays a key role in that sort of policy development. So so that's kind of the piece that I'm bringing to that puzzle, and I work with some colleagues that have overlapping interests.
Very interesting. How did you first personally become interested in transnational activism and civil society actors, etc., even before you started your PhD? What sparked that?
So I'll try to keep the story concise. So after my undergraduate, I worked for a faith-based nonprofit organization called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And for many intents and purposes, I was essentially a campus minister. I worked with spiritual development and mentoring for college students, but within an NGO context. And I did that for 4 years, and that gave me a lot of perspective on the sort of organizational development, leadership training, and things that happen in kind of small-scale or locally rooted NGOs. After I did my master's, I went and took that experience and was an NGO advisor with the U.S. Peace Corps in West Africa. And it was there that I became interested in issues of global policy, because I came to the development field, maybe like many people do, thinking like, we've got a lot of research and we know how to fix these problems, and if only we were to implement the problems really well, we could kind of, I don't know, wipe out these, kind of wipe out whatever the issues are that we're facing, kind of very top-down approach. And I mean, I was only on the ground a few months before I kind of threw all those ideas out the window and realized that a lot of the top-down policies were not always super well informed about conditions on the ground, but that local people were very well informed about conditions on the ground. I mean, the people that I worked with in Togo were incredibly knowledgeable, motivated, and I wondered why it was that they didn't have more influence over the policies that were affecting them. And so when I went to do my PhD, that was the thing that I set out to really look at, to understand how it was that local stakeholders were represented in international policy-making processes. And at the time, the really dominant theory was, well, civil society is going to be the way that these local stakeholders get involved. And so I set out to sort of test the hypotheses about that.
I see. Interesting. So within your field of research, or your various fields of research, what do you see some of the core challenges that particularly transnationally operating NGOs have, that they have to address, and what are their strengths but also their weaknesses in dealing with those challenges?
I would say the biggest challenge, I would say it's kind of twofold. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that NGOs face is obviously the economic environment and the ways in which NGOs are constrained by the market environment in which they find themselves. I think that we like to think about advocacy as sort of being based in altruism, and since you're kind of doing everything in sort of an altruistic or a voluntary fashion, the money shouldn't really matter. But the money does matter, because people need salaries, and people want to be able to retire, and people need health care, and you've got to keep the lights on. And so there's this constraining economic environment. And I know that the Transnational NGO Initiative, I mean, one of the core findings from the big 150 interviews that you guys did was that there was a desire to be more responsive to grassroots stakeholders, but that other organizational concerns, including I think some of these financial things, always got in the way. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges that NGOs face, is kind of how to manage the financial constraints in such a way as to be attuned to the needs of, as attuned to the needs of local stakeholders as they want to be, kind of how to manage the competing demands of two different groups of stakeholders, the end beneficiaries of their actions and the donors who also have a stake in how their money is spent. So, I mean, that's a core concern. But even more, what I would suggest, or not even more, but in addition, what I would suggest is that all of that is predicated on the assumption that NGOs want the right things, that NGOs want to be responsive to the grassroots stakeholders, and that the donors are part of what's getting in the way. And what I would say that my research suggests is that donors don't always want the right thing, or sorry, excuse me, NGOs don't always want the right things. A lot of the time I feel like NGO missions and all of the things that are associated with an NGO mission, kind of an organizational culture and an approach to a problem and a sense for what the problems are, were determined by very well-meaning people based in New York and Washington, D.C. and Chicago, many of whom have not spent the sort of lifetime in the developing context that the end beneficiaries have. And so sometimes I feel like even if NGOs were liberated from the donor constraints, I still don't know whether or not they would be as responsive to the end beneficiaries as they would like to be.
Both the capacity and the willingness you're querying.
Yes, exactly. So there's the capacity but the willingness. Thank you. That's an excellent way of phrasing it. And so I think that there's probably some deeper reconsideration that has to happen in terms of how is it that our missions and agendas were set originally, and to what degree are we willing to redefine ourselves in light of our stated desire to empower end beneficiaries.
So in terms of forecasting, if we look into the medium to longer term future, what are the organizational challenges, since here in the TNGO initiative for us, the NGO as an organization is the unit of analysis. What organizational challenges will what's coming at the sector, the community in the medium to long term pose for these transnationally operating NGOs particularly?
That's an excellent question. And I feel like the Transnational NGO Initiative already has so many creative ideas on this that we were discussing this morning about, say, digitally based NGOs and things like that, that I admit that I'm sort of more interested in your answer to that question than mine, but I'll give you my perspective.
Yeah, please.
Which is, the thing that I'm most aware of right now is the rising number of middle-income countries and shifts in the global aid environment as a result of that rising number of middle-income countries. And I think that probably you'll see it in both the service delivery segment of activities and the advocacy segment. I mean, I know many organizations operate in both of those segments, so I don't really want to think of them as sectors. But I think that on the advocacy side, you have an increasing number of professionalized and sort of economically empowered organizations coming out of middle-income countries that are looking for a seat at the table and who are willing to claim that seat on their own, not necessarily through a northern-dominated or northern organized network. And so looking at the evolution of transnational advocacy networks and knowledge networks and things like that in light of middle-income country empowerment or the middle-income country NGO empowerment.
That's interesting, yeah.
So I think that there's going to be shifting power dynamics there. And then I feel like in the service delivery area, the ways in which aid funding is shifting as more countries move to middle-income status and donors begin to reconsider their commitment, sometimes in countries that they've been in for a very long time in light of their middle-income status. I think it's axiomatic that when a country is doing well, more donors tend to crowd in. But then some of those countries, like Ghana, for instance, have become middle-income countries, and that's actually causing a reconsideration to this very kind of some of these kind of long-term presence of foreign donors. You know, should we really be in a middle-income country when there are so many low-income countries that have greater need? And so I think that there's a coming realignment of transnational aid, and I think that's going to impact both local civil society and transnational civil society.
Well, very nice answers, and it makes me think of the work on disruptive change, you know, by, for instance, the International Civil Society Center, in reference to your first issue around middle-income countries. So, are there any areas that relate to the role, advocacy, etc., of TNGOs that are under-examined that you think students who are currently in Maxwell ought to start paying attention to, especially if they want to go into whether academia or policy research, think tanks, etc.?
Well, maybe this is my bias, but I think that the political economy of advocacy is under-examined. I mean, it's something that I'm doing research in, and there are some people who are contributing to this. Clifford Bobb, I think of in particular. I feel like Elizabeth Bloodgood has done some work in this, and obviously some work has happened that's related to this here at Maxwell. But I still think that in general it's an under-examined area, looking at and in particular, looking beyond just the ways that economic constraints impact an individual NGO, to consider the environment. Think of NGOs as operating in a marketplace, and what are the dynamics in that marketplace? What are the supply? You know, what are the things being supplied? Who are the people who are exerting demand? Are there barriers to entry? Are there first mover advantages? So I think that bringing in some of these economic concepts into the advocacy realm, I think, could be very useful.
Would be useful. Thank you so much for this interview today. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. My pleasure.